So the question of whose security is our topic, and the question of whose security pertains to the who should be protected from aggression, who should be protected from the violence of aggression. And ultimately, we'll argue that that question of who should be protected is grounded potentially in a basic right to security of person. That's where we're headed. Aggression is a crime of both a moral and legal crime of the unjustified use of force, physical force, often military force, that results in direct violence. So aggression can be done by individuals when they act violently towards others. Aggression is often the actions of governments against other governments and peoples. Aggression can be perpetrated by the police against innocent citizens, etc. So the key for aggression is that it is unjustifiable. It is an unjustified use of force, military force. And the most prominent form is unjustified military invasion of a nation. And we've seen those in recent decades, the invasion of other countries militarily, which has a long and prominent history, has been fairly absent in the world system, except last February. Well, it actually started in 2014. Russia invaded the Ukraine, seized territory in the east of Ukraine and the Crimea Peninsula on the Black Sea of Ukraine. And then in February last year, they attempted a full-scale invasion. The Russians invaded Ukraine, attempting to seize the capital, Kyiv, and its government. And they thought they could easily do that. They were wrong, of course. But that's the most recent example of full-scale military aggression. We could argue that there's a universal right to security of person, that right to security, which is a basic right, one could argue, that life would not be very fruitful if we were under threat or directly experiencing physical harm against us on a regular basis. That would be a great detriment to the realization of any conceivable conception of the good life. So given that security is a basic good, we could argue that it is a basic right, that we have a justified demand or claim for it. Each person does. And also that the scope of that right transcends national boundaries or borders. That every human being is a member of a global moral community, and as such has a basic right to security of person. That's a big claim. It seems reasonable, but the scope of that claim is often contested. And it's contested by two prominent theories of international relations which deal with the nature of security. The two theories are political realism and the theory of international society, or international society theory. These theories, both of these theories in their own way, maintain that individual persons, you and I, do not have moral and legal standing. That is, we have no rights per se, or any claims, justified claims, outside the borders of our own nation. Now, we only have justified claims within the boundary of the nation state. Both of these theories argue that the international arena is either an anarchy or an international system of states, of governments, both of which deny the claim that individuals have rights outside the borders of their own nation state. We'll discuss that further. And that is therefore, from these two perspectives, the individual does not have a claim in themselves for security. Individuals have to appeal to their government for security. They can't appeal to any kind of right outside of their nation state. So let's discuss this. Further. So international political realism, very old. It's an old theory. It goes back at least to the ancient Athenians and the Spartans. And it's been given expression by a number of theorists throughout history. One of them is Thucydides, the ancient Greek historian, the founder of the architect of the discipline of history. In his Peloponnesian study of the Peloponnesian War, the war between Athens and Sparta, he makes the claim that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. So the strong, those with power, those with strength, will try to prevail in achieving their interests, and if one is in a weaker position, then one will have to suffer the consequences of the strong's pursuit of their own interests. Karl von Clausewitz, a 19th century military theorist and strategist in Prussia, which became Germany, argued that war is politics by other means. That is, the use of military force is justifiable if it serves the interests of a state. If a state can use its military power to achieve its ends, then that is fully justified. And Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes, the 16th, 17th century British philosopher, famous author of Leviathan, argued that when there is no government, then we have a state of nature, an anarchy. And the state of nature, or an anarchy, is a war of all against all. Without the commanding power of a government, there will be continual fighting or the continual threat of violence among human beings. And the argument from political realism is that because there's no world government, there's no overarching political authority outside of the nation state. Therefore, the international arena, the relations between countries is a state of nature. It's a war of all against all. Pretty bleak theory, but a very prominent one. It's been dominant for centuries, this view. And it has its advocates still in many governments. The core elements of realism are that it has many features, elements. One is that our nature is to be self-interested, and that we human beings have tendencies towards domination of others. That's the primary, that makes it realistic. That we tend to serve our interests and to use power to achieve those interests. And this is the nature of governments comply with human nature in that sense. Predominantly states are self-interested. They will pursue the national interest whenever they can. Second element is international anarchy, a condition wherein there exists no higher legal or moral authority than individual nation states. So there's no legitimate authority, legal or moral. There's no legality, there's no morality in the relationship between governments and between peoples. And this speaks to its moral skepticism that morality and law stop at the border of the nation state. There's no international law, there's no international morality because there's no world government, is the claim, is the argument. Realists believe in national sovereignty, that is the final and absolute political authority is located in national governments, in the nation state. Sovereignty refers to political power, and that no higher, if one is sovereign, there exists no higher authority than that which is sovereign. So if the state has national sovereignty, realism argues there's no authority above the nation state to rule over it. So it's the nation state who rules over its people, and there's no sovereign above the nation state. And therefore the state will pursue it based in human nature, will pursue its national interests via the exercise of whatever power it has. The more power it has, the more it can exert its will, as Thucydides taught us. If it's weak, if the nation state is weak, then it'll be subject to the power of others. And from that perspective, military force is a means for the achievement of political aims. And it's within realism, once the nation state's power is connected, deeply connected to its military prowess. The stronger the military, the more power the state has to exercise its will against others. And of course, military strength is connected to economic strength in particular. You have to have money in order to, lots of it, to have military power. From a security point of view, which is our main focus here, the focus is on national security. and you hear this often. It's in the interest of national security, politicians often say. We have to do this because national security is at stake. And what the reference is here to national security is the security of the state, as well as its constituents, but mainly the security of the state is the priority. And the protection of the state to preserve it from attack is the core organizing principle of the state. There is a dilemma, there is a security dilemma involved here in relationship to other nation states. And, of course, based upon these ideas, a government will attempt to increase its military power. It will invest in military resources. It will develop, as best it can, sophisticated weapon systems, etc., and have large armies and navies, etc., large military, if it can, if it has the power. So as one state begins to, out of its rational interest, its interest in having power to serve its political ends, in particular its survival, other nations, not knowing clearly with certainty the intentions of the state, will say, they're arming, they're increasing their military power. That makes us vulnerable to them. We must increase our military power in response. They're doing it, especially neighbors. They're increasing their power. We have to counter with increased power. And then the other state said, those guys are arming. They're responding with significant military power. We have to increase our expenditure on the military. And this creates in the world a escalation of military power in the world. Ironically, and here's the dilemma, that the interest in becoming secure leads with the escalation of military power in the world, an arms race leads to greater insecurity. So the desire to be secure leads to increased insecurity, potentially. That's a problem with realism. So these are the core elements of political realism. Do you have any questions? Does that make sense? We're going to debate whether this is agreeable or not, but it is a very prominent way of thinking about the world and the international sphere. Many famous diplomats have been realists, have adopted the philosophy of realism. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was premised upon realism. Because in order to keep everyone secure, especially the state, from this perspective, the key, it is argued, the key is to achieve a balance of power between states. If there is a balance of power between the nations of the world, then that will put a check, that will constrain anyone from thinking about using their military power to pursue their interests, to invade other countries, because the cost will be too high. If there's a balance of power, then success in military action is very unlikely. Or, as has been the case, you might, in recent decades, there might be a dominant world power, military power, who's plays the role of an international police force. And the United States has played that role, not to limited success, in preventing outbreaks of military warfare. So the key to peace, the key to security from the realist point of view, is this balance of power. So, for example, Russia calculated that the Ukraine was weak militarily, that we could invade them and seize control of their government and the territory of that government without too much fuss. They were wrong, because they weren't counting on, I don't think they were counting on the Europeans and the United States and the Japanese to support the Ukrainians with military arms. And of course they underestimated the will and courage of the Ukrainian people. They're going to fight to the death. They're not going to let Russia win. They'd rather, and we can discuss this, but they seem to be very committed and courageous to protecting their nation, and that's very admirable. So security is achieved through the balance of power. It deters, and it can be achieved often with alliances. Groups of nations will align, allies will align to create military alliances to balance power. And we have NATO, for example, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which protects Europe, designed to protect Europe from really a Russian, in the past the Soviet, but now Russian aggression in Europe. And it's been successful in balancing that power from a realist point of view. Pretty successful. The important thing here for our purposes is that security from this perspective pertains to the state, protecting the government and its officials, and not necessarily the people. Not, in some versions, the people can be expendable, are expendable. If the state is threatened, we'll send young men and women to their death in order to protect the state. So those are the basic tenets of realism. Any questions so far? Understandable? One could argue in response to realism that morality and the law potentially are not contingent upon the existence of an enforcing power. That you can have morality and law without a overarching authority to enforce that law. You can, in fact, morality and law are based less on enforcement and more on agreement, mutual, reciprocal agreement. So the claim of realism, the Hobbesian claim of realism that you can't have law or morality if there doesn't exist a powerful government over enforcing that law, is not fully accurate. So we can look to reciprocity and mutual agreement as the foundation of morality, of justice, rather than enforcement of a particular governmental entity. if we pull that, if that turns out to be correct or valid, rather, then one of the core pillars of realism will fall, and with it, its apparatus. On the positive, realism may provide us with something positive, and that is the idea of the balance of power, which may provide conditions for mutual agreement. So we may look to maintaining a balance of power, as well as mutual agreement across states and peoples. Questions? Comments?
Do you feel like in the future with us kind of going to more, nuclear stuff, that balance of power is like we're getting closer to that, do you think?
Well, that was yeah, in a certain sense. Although we exist on the precipice of total annihilation every day.
It's like an extreme balance of power.
Yeah. Of course, the nuclear policy that was developed in the Cold War was the policy of mutual assured destruction. That if either the United States or the Soviet Union, the dominant nuclear powers in the world at the time, and still are, would launch a first strike, that would initiate a full-on nuclear exchange. And the society, the country, the government that launched the strike would be destroyed in turn. So it would be suicidal to launch a nuclear weapon under that policy. And we're assuming that even the government of the Soviet Union was a rational actor, not crazy, not suicidal, not interested in being destroyed. So yeah, nuclear weapons, the justification for nuclear weapons in our history is to maintain a balance of power. And also for, if you have a nuclear weapon, for example, and you're a smaller power, like North Korea or Israel. Of course, Israel claims it doesn't have nuclear weapons, but we know they do. They have a large arsenal of nuclear weapons. But if you're a smaller nation, and Iran seeks a nuclear weapon, among others. If you're a smaller nation with a vulnerable position, you would want a nuclear weapon to prevent others from invading your space, because you have the threat of launching a nuclear strike.
Do Ukraine have nukes?
No, they did actually. They had a huge arsenal of nuclear weapons from the Soviet Union. The third largest arsenal of nuclear weapons. Much more nuclear power than it's ridiculous actually. You can destroy life on the planet 50 times over. Ukraine had a very large nuclear arsenal at the end of when they were liberated from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapsed. Ukraine was a central republic of the Soviet Union, and it had a huge arsenal. And the government of the Ukraine decided, with an agreement with the Russian government, the new Russian government, that they would give up their nuclear weapons. They didn't want to have nuclear weapons. It's very expensive, etc., to maintain. They didn't want them, and morally they didn't want them. And they signed an agreement with the Russian government for mutual security. A pact that Russia would not invade the Ukraine if the Ukraine gave up its nuclear In hindsight, they might have kept one to maintain their balance of power. But they gave them all up, and that has led to their invasion, one could argue. Other questions, other thoughts on realism? Does this have any appeal? Realism? It's realistic power. It does highlight at least a problem with international law and morality, that there is no world government, and that it's a little tricky to have to base one's relations on agreements, treaty agreements that no one is capable of enforcing, that can be violated when it serves the interests of the state. The US government has entered into many treaties that they have violated when the national interest called for. Most recently, the Trump administration's taking us out of the agreement with Iran, the Iran nuclear agreement, and the Paris climate change agreement, violating the treaties, etc. But many administrations have violated treaties. So it does highlight it's a little tricky here. And do you need something above to enforce agreements, or are agreements powerful enough to maintain security? That's a big question. The second challenger to the right of security, the universal right of security of person, is the theory of international society. The starting point for international society is the existence of states and state sovereignty, the claiming right to an assertion of sovereignty. So international society is based on the assumption that each nation state has sovereignty, that is, they have supremacy over the jurisdiction under the territory under which they control. And that it controls as well the population in its territory, the government. So it shares that with realism, that there is national sovereignty, and it's of a particular, almost absolute, has almost an absolute quality. Cannot be, it's not contingent, not dependent on other considerations. But the nation, the government is sovereign. And that means it has independence from outside authority. So no, one government can't tell another government what to do, per se, or cannot force them, or legitimately force them into what they don't want to do. The idea of sovereignty, the right to sovereignty, central to international society, invokes a duty, as all rights do, as we know, a duty of non-intervention. So and it's a mutual duty of non-intervention. So if each state in the world, each society, national society, and government in the world is sovereign, then what is invoked, it is argued, is a duty of each not to interfere or intervene in the affairs of other states. So international society, or the possibility of an international society, is grounded in this duty of non-intervention. That it's not justifiable, normally justifiable, to intervene or interfere in the affairs of other states, including invading their territory, militarily invading their territory. So there's a strong, and this is a moral and legal duty to not to intervene in the affairs of others. And that follows from the right to sovereignty. So this claim here is a claim of moral duty and legal duty that's independent of any world government or external force to enforce it. It's based in agreement. If we're going to have an international society based on sovereignty, then everyone has a duty not to interfere in the affairs of others. That makes sense? That's a very important principle, non-intervention. This creates the possibility of an international order in order to implement the sovereignty, the right to sovereignty or self-determination, and the duty of non-intervention. An international legal order has been created, established, consisting of a system of international institutions and regimes. So there's a vast array that exists of institutions and regimes, legal and moral regimes, based upon mutual agreements between governments. And they address political, economic, legal issues, among other issues. The United Nations, perhaps, is the most prominent of those institutions. Military alliances like NATO, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, among many others. So sometimes this is referred to as the liberal international order. This vast array of agreements, treaties, conventions, institutions designed to create a moral and legal system of relations between states. And the relations here are between states. So there's a common set of rules or laws that all are obligated to follow based upon agreements, the obligation to honor one's agreements, there's obligation to limit based upon the duty of non-intervention, to limit the use of force, military force. So in international society, the only justifiable reason for using military force in the international system is self-defense. And that makes aggression, the invasion of other nations, unjustifiable. So, and this is very, I think, very significant conception of security from international society, just from a military point of view, that really the use of warfare, von Clausewitz's claim that war is the extension, is politics by other means, has been very constrained by international law, by agreement. That the only justifiable use of military force is self-defense, and the defense of innocent others, allies, etc. And there's significant cooperation in the workings of common institutions, and a general norm of cooperation is prevails in those institutions, although maneuvering politics is perpetual and intense in these institutions. Though there's still a political maneuvering, of course, and the pursuit of national interests within the framework of international society. But the use of force to pursue those interests has been outlawed, if you will, has become criminal in the society by agreement. The goals of the Society of States or International Society is the preservation, first and foremost, the preservation of the system and the Society of States. So the first goal is to preserve the international order, and that's a priority. It's the system's preservation, the security of the international order. I don't know if you noticed, there was many, during the Trump administration, there were many concerns expressed in the media and by various politicians that the Trump administration was attempting to dismantle or to harm the international order with its policies, America First policies. The second goal is to maintain independence or sovereignty of individual states. And this is subordinate to the first goal. So if a state is an aggressor, is using force to achieve its ends, invading others, then the system is in jeopardy, and their sovereignty can be infringed upon, therefore. So if one is a bad actor, one loses one's claim to sovereignty, and as others can invade, stop them from their aggression. The third goal is negative peace, the absence of war between states. And the fourth goal is to, I'm repeating this, sorry. The fourth goal is to maintain the adherence to the common rules of the society, of the international society. In terms of security, this means security is not only achieved through a balance of military power, but more fundamentally, it's achieved through the adherence and commitment to the principles of justice, of international society, namely respect for sovereignty and the duty of non-intervention. So security for all can be achieved if everyone agrees to and commits to the principle of non-intervention. Security here remains within the orbit of the nation state. So from this perspective, it's the nation, it's the government, the nation state itself that is to be secured, national security against aggression of others, as well as security of the international system of states is to be made secure. So the object, or the subject of security again is the nation and its government, and not individual people as such. So that's the basic tenets of international society. Questions, comments? Is this familiar to you? Does this sound familiar? Maybe a little. has been a very important perspective. And maybe it has become the dominant perspective in certain circles over realism, especially the prohibition against invasion, military invasion of others, and commitment to non-intervention. And governments will go, if they have aggressive tendencies, they will go out of their way to try to justify their actions and their violation of non-intervention as self-defense, including the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. The Russians, Putin argued that we're protecting the Russian population, which is BS. Just pure propaganda. It's a lie. Yeah, Angela.
I was just gonna ask, you answered my questions. I was gonna ask about Russia invading Ukraine with that being an example, and then you said it as I was about to ask, so never mind.
Great minds. Yeah, yeah. Well, the reason it's a prominent example, and we're currently living through. And we haven't been affected by the invasion. Not physically per se, but economically. Even the price of beer has gone up. Ukraine is a big barley and grain producer. Of course, everyone has always wanted the Ukraine, right? Because it has very fertile agricultural land, especially in the central part.
We also haven't, because of the Russian-Ukraine conflict, we also stopped buying alcohol, vodka from Russia as well, I believe.
Yeah.
So that also has skyrocketed prices of alcohol as well.
Yeah. Gasoline,
Gas, yeah.
although it's come down. President Biden authorized the release of 1 million barrels of oil per day from the National Reserve. We have huge oil reserves and natural gas reserves. So we released that into the market, and that has brought the price down. So supply and demand dynamic. So Russia is a big oil producer, natural gas producer. And that, because they invaded the price, there was concerns about supply, and that raised the price, right? $6 a gallon here in the US, and much higher elsewhere. And that got everyone worked up, right? What, the world is ending, $6 a gallon. What is Biden doing? Of course, if any president has very little control over the price of oil, because it's a world market, although the releasing reserves is the one thing that the national government could do to affect the global market. So, yeah, international society. Make sense? Understand? Here again, it's the security of the state that is prominent, and not its citizens as such. Although there's much talk usually of protecting the people. But when you look at it closely, it's a commitment to the national interest of government. So swinging back to the idea of the possibility of a human right to security of person, and the possibility, therefore, of a global society, it can be argued that nation states, the U.S. government, the government of Great Britain, of Germany, etc., of Israel, that they do not possess rights in themselves, but they are the bearers and representatives and the trustees of the rights of the individuals that comprise them. that state rights, the rights of a government, are a manifestation of individual rights. And states derive their sovereignty, that is their authority and their rights and duties, from the consent of the people. And that's our, as a country, that's our founding document. That's our founding principle, rather. We the people. The source of the authority of the government is derived from the people. And therefore its claims for sovereignty is grounded in individual rights. And also the principle of non-intervention rests on individual right of security of person as well as self-determination. So the source of sovereignty, it can be argued, is individual rights. The rights of individual citizens, you and I, is the ground or the basis of sovereignty. And from this perspective, security can be achieved, only achieved, through an order, a moral, legal, and political global order that guarantees the rights of all human beings. So this is a human rights perspective or conception of security. That security is about the protection and the realization of human rights. Article 23 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states, and I'm paraphrasing, that everyone has a right, each person has a right to a society, to live in a society that will guarantee all of their human rights, all of the rights listed in this declaration. Article 23, therefore, is a very, very powerful statement of a conception of global society and a conception of security, conception of peace as the protection and realization of each person's human rights. So in this conception, we have moved away from national security, perhaps to a conception of human security. That it's individual rights that is the subject, should be the subject of security. And that when, what is violated when one government invades another country is the rights of the people and not the rights of the government. So that the crime of aggression is really a violation of the human rights of the people who have been invaded, and not their government as such. Because the government is a creature of them, it represents them. But it's the people who are the real holders, bearers of rights. So we have we have a notion of perhaps of human security here, rather than national security. And that would expand the notion not of security from military security to all kinds of forms of security and the protection of all of our rights. It would be economic security, food security, cultural security, that kind of idea. A much broader notion of what justice would demand. From this point of view. Very, very idealistic, but powerful. Something to perhaps to strive for. So our question is which form of these, and these are three prominent conceptions of security and its requirements. And our task is to think about which is most which is most justifiable from the point of view of fairness in particular. What principles of security would we endorse and affirm as a part of our peace constitution? And why would justify that? And also what can we refute the alternatives? So if we choose realism, can we demonstrate why international society, global society, human security is unjustifiable in whatever way, vice versa. Questions? Comments? On Thursday, we'll have a little exercise for you to finish today, but on Thursday, we'll break up into groups and begin, and we'll work on that question as our first step in drafting our Constitution. But any questions? I've just covered in an hour a huge terrain. It's probably more complicated, but I think I got the essence of it. I'm confident I have the core essence of each of these for my study. My long study of the subject. Questions? What appeals to you at the outset? Which theory? Realism, international society, or human security? Any initial thoughts? You don't have to have any initial thoughts.
On the surface, human security.
On the surface? Human security. Seems appealing?
Mm-hmm. Probably leads into that essence of like, you know, being an individual.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we have to think about it more. It might be appealing. We have to ask why. Why is it appealing? Why would others affirm that? Why do you affirm it? Great. Other thoughts? So I thought we could oops. I thought we could discuss briefly in groups the Putin doctrine, which is the justification for the invasion and other action, the invasion of Ukraine and other actions by the Russian government, including perhaps interference in our own elections, and clearly interference in the elections of various politicians in Europe. The Russian government has funded right-wing candidates in Europe, including Marine Le Pen in France, who fortunately lost the election. But the Italians have just elected a far-right fascist prime minister. And Sweden has just elected a very far-right party in the parliament in Sweden. So authoritarianism is alive and well in the world. Yeah.
I've heard about the new Italian Prime Minister, especially her plan inside the classrooms, because I study education, and she plans on limiting the amount of foreign students who are allowed in the which I found very strange. Like that's what mostly the people are talking about online about her. That's all I've really heard about her. Her plan of limiting the amount of foreign students from other countries. So I haven't really known what the big deal is about her other than that.
Yeah. Well, that's a part of the platform.
Okay.
The far-right platform is to curtail immigration and the influence of foreigners on the culture and life of the society, of the national society. So it's an anti-immigration, anti-foreigner, if you will, for lack of a better word, political position.
Okay.
Keep them out is the platform. Because they'll stay, right? We have these students coming from Africa or from India or China, etc. They'll want to stay in our beautiful Italy. We don't want them here. We have to keep Italy pure.
Okay. I understand that. Thank you.
Yeah. And that's a part of the platform, and it has roots in fascism. And she, blanking on her name. Maybe I'm repressing it.
Giorgia Meloni. Giorgia Meloni.
Yes, Giorgia Meloni. She's retracted this, but she, for a long time, sung the praises of Mussolini.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
She sung, in her past, sung the praises of Mussolini, the former fascist dictator of Italy during World War II and strong ally of Nazi Germany. And of course, Mussolini was one of the original architects of fascism as a political theory. And they implemented it in the late 20s and early 1930s in Italy. Of course, he was killed by his own people in the end. Yeah, she was a big fan of Mussolini. And a part of the fascist program, of course, is racial purity and cultural purity. It's kind of build a wall kind of mentality. We've undergone that in our own society in recent years. Italy first, America first. So there's this wave, anti-immigration, it's racist, wave occurring in Europe as well as in South America. Brazil has undergone similar developments. The United States, of course, with the election of Donald Trump and the MAGA movement, Make America Great Again. What is that code for? Wow, Make America. I didn't realize we weren't great. What happened? I think they're thinking of the 1950s, 40s. We were great back then. It's code for various grievances against the demographic shifts and cultural shifts, really, that are occurring in these societies, more liberal in their outlooks towards difference of all kinds, cultural, ethnic, sexual orientation, narcos, it's polluting, and of course, Nazi fascism was based upon a strong theory of racial purity. In fact, the final solution was grounded in the claim that we, the Nazis, the Germans, had to keep the population pure from the polluting influence of Jews and others. That seems to be a standard pillar of fascist philosophy, racial purity. Of course, it's made up, right? It's just a fabrication. race is a social construction, it's not real, because we're all one species, Homo sapiens. And biology doesn't, race is not a biological concept. There are no races in biology, there are species, right? There are no races. So race is a construction, social construction, used to divide and to oppress others, historically. But it's not real, grounded in biology. I mean, we're almost identical, right? We're almost identical genetically. Very, very slight variations in the genetic code of each of us. We're pretty much the same, right? Maybe a little shading of the skin, some little minor facial features, hair, different kinds of hair. I got white hair. But it's ridiculous. We're almost completely identical, right? But we have this huge thing of race that has been constructed to serve certain political interests and power, etc. So, rambling on here, apologies. But, good question. The Putin Doctrine, I guess we won't really have time, but let me, this is the basic justification for Putin's invasion and its political activity. The doctrine suggests that Russia claims special prerogatives within its sphere of influence, including most prominently the former Soviet republics, in particular the Ukraine, as the jewel in the Soviet crown. So that a claim of a sphere of privileged interest rather, Russia claims. It is former in its territory, claims that it has special interests in those countries. Secondly, the argument that there's a historic unity between Russia and the Ukraine. That actually Ukraine is really Russia. There's no difference between the Ukrainians and the Russians. Actually, Ukraine doesn't really exist. And this is something Putin said to President Bush in 2008. George, he says, you have to understand that Ukraine is not even a country. Part of its territory is in Eastern Europe, and the greater part was given to us, end quote. That's what Vladimir Putin says to George Bush. So a belief in that really Ukraine is Russia. A third pillar of the doctrine is that the great powers, powerful nation states, are more sovereign, have a greater claim to sovereignty than other nations. The great powers, meaning Russia, Great Britain, maybe the United States in particular, have more sovereignty than other nations. That there's a hierarchy, and that Russia is on top of that hierarchy. So they can roll back the rights of sovereignty of lesser powers, justifiably, is the claim. The fourth claim is that democracy, the existence of democratic governments, and the liberal international order, international society that we discussed, and elements of human rights as well, are threats to authoritarian power. That democracy and the liberal order, international order, is a threat to the power of authoritarian states like Russia. And we must, from Putin's point of view, we must, and from China's point of view, among others, we must crush democracy in whatever way we can. And we must dismantle this liberal international order created by the United States after World War II. And Ukraine, a democratic Ukraine the treasure of Ukraine cannot be democratic. That is a bridge too far for Putin and the Putin doctrine. An example of Ukrainian democracy, a thriving, economically prosperous, democratic Ukraine connected to Western Europe and the international order is a vital threat to our authority in the region. It must be crushed. And the use of military force is justified if privileged interests, the sphere of privileged interests, are threatened. And Russia, in relative to the Ukraine, has privileged interests in the Ukraine. And therefore, its military occupation, invasion and occupation of the Ukraine is perfectly justifiable according to the Putin doctrine. This is the belief system, set of principles that guides the thinking and the actions of the Russian government, current Russian government, in its relations to others, in particular those close to them geographically. But also their interference in other governments. Their attempt to influence elections so that certain candidates are elected. And they played a major role in the 2016 U.S. presidential election, supporting Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton. Putin did not want Clinton to be president of the United States. Had great dislike for Clinton and knew that Clinton would stand up to him. Trump, on the other hand, we could get Donald in the presidency. Maybe we can pull this Putin doctrine off. He'll support us. He'll support what we do. He's in sympathy to what. Note out of office, Donald Trump at the Russian invasion began of Ukraine, he stated publicly that Putin's a genius. Putin's a genius. What do you think of the Putin doctrine? Is it compelling? Is it justifiable from the point of view of fairness? Would we have reason to reject it? Would the Ukrainians have reason to reject it? Yeah, good reason. Pretty wild. We have to be aware of these things, how leaders think and what their agendas are in the world. And that forms their decisions, their actions. It's a very interesting, but I think very distorted. It's very arrogant, right? Because we are great. We Russians are great, or at least I am great. Putin, I'm speaking as Putin. Have special privileges in the world. We should dominate others. Rightly so. We are the power.
So is Putin just gonna continue the invasion into Ukraine until he has the land that he wants, or he's killed everyone? What is his final goal?
The final goal is to completely occupy Ukraine, to topple the government, to kill President Zelensky and the officials of his government, and to claim the Ukraine as a part of Russia, and to rule over Ukraine, the territory of the Ukraine. And the people are expecting it. he's already killed hundreds of thousands of innocent people. 100,000 in the area of Putin. So that's the goal. He's not gonna achieve that goal. He's failing. He's failing. In fact, they just instituted a draft because they're running out of soldiers. Huge number of Russian soldiers have been killed. Just it's terrible. And they're resisting it. Young men in Russia now are resisting being drafted.
Yeah, I saw that if they get drafted and they flee the country, it's like 10 years in jail. It's like
Yeah.
the minimum.
Most of them are in like Georgian borders, trying to escape. So, sorry, do you think like
Yeah.
if Russia gains more power and go to a next level of attacking Ukraine, do you think like the other governments will go in to help Ukraine, or do you think that will lead to like another big war?
Well, the problem with, we can arm the Ukrainians, and we have, with very sophisticated weapon systems that are effective, have been very effective. And the Ukrainian forces are pushing the Russians out. They're making advances. Because through certain, they're able to fire missiles, for example, and destroy ammunition and other resources, which is hurting the Russian effort. So that, but to send US troops or NATO troops, Polish troops into the Ukraine would invite potentially a nuclear exchange. So no one can take that chance, right? Because if NATO was involved, then Russia would have been defeated in early March of last year. It would take days. But Putin, the Russians have a large nuclear arsenal, and that you can't take that risk, right? You can't take a risk, even though Putin's always rattling the nuclear saber. Will you use any means necessary, that kind of thing. But he's not insane. As far as we know.
He would also die.
He's not suicidal. It's not in his interest to commit suicide.
Yeah. I mean.
So that prevents the very powerful NATO forces from intervening there because of the nuclear question.
Kind of like blackmailing,
Yeah.
See, I
I have
think
no
that.
idea. I hope
I
like
was so
somebody
old.
like